Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of the Bedouins, the desert nomads who managed to survive in places so hot that even the sun seemed to take breaks out of pity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever thought your summer vacation was too hot, congratulations, you've never met the Arabian desert. This isn't your sunburn from a beach chair kind of heat. This is heat that could melt your sandals while you're still wearing them, the kind of heat that makes air itself feel personal. You don't walk in this heat, you negotiate with it. And the sand? Oh, it's not just hot, it's vindictive. It's in your shoes, your food, your ears, and somehow in your soul. But for the Bedouins, nomadic Arab tribes who called this furnace home, this wasn't punishment. It was just Tuesday. The Arabian desert, particularly the Rub al-Khali or empty quarter, is one of the most inhospitable places on earth. And yet, Bedouins managed to raise families, herd animals, and drink tea in it. Tea, in 45-degree heat. Meanwhile, most of us get cranky if the air conditioning breaks for more than 4 minutes. So how did they do it? They didn't rely on fancy gear or climate-controlled shelters. They had no cooling towels, smartwatches, or filtered water bottles named after mountains. What they did have was a deep, generational understanding of the desert's rhythms, and an impressive tolerance for discomfort. To them, the desert wasn't an enemy to fight. It was more like a very strict landlord. You respected it, followed the rules, and in return, it might let you live. The Bedouins' entire way of life was engineered for survival. From their breathable black goat hair tents to their carefully timed daily routines, everything had a purpose. No movement was wasted. No drop of water was taken for granted. You'd never catch a Bedouin power walking at noon just to hit a step goal. That kind of behaviour gets you turned into a cautionary tale. Their secret weapon? Adaptation. Not the shiny app-updating kind, but the dusty, sun-beaten, trial-by-fire kind that comes from generations of learning what works and what gets you cooked like a lamb kebab. In the desert, shade isn't just nice, it's essential. It's not, oh, this is pleasant kind of shade. It's thank you for not dying here kind of shade. If you've never stood under a palm tree in 118-degree Maine and felt your soul slowly reattach to your body, then you've never truly understood gratitude. The Bedouins, of course, mastered the art of chasing, creating, and preserving shade like it was treasure. Because it was. Forget beachfront property. In the Arabian desert, real estate value is measured in square inches of darkness. Their first line of defense? The Beit al-Sha'ar, or House of Hair. And yes, that's as literal as it sounds. These tents were woven from goat hair, which, through some miracle of desert engineering, expanded when wet, rare but helpful during sudden rain, and stayed breathable when dry. It was climate control before HVAC, and with far fewer complaints to the landlord. The tents were mobile, of course, because you never know when the desert will suddenly decide your neighbourhood is now a hot plate. But they weren't just dragged anywhere. Bedouins positioned them strategically, always keeping in mind the wind direction, the sun's angle, and the location of the one lone tree in a 50-mile radius. And when no goat hair tent was available, improvisation kicked in. Camels made excellent shade providers, big, tall, and relatively immobile when chewing cud. A Bedouin might rest in a camel's shadow or, in more desperate moments, just dig a shallow trench and lie in it like a sandworm with style. Even small rocks, dune shadows, or saddlebags became tools in the shade game. The Bedouins didn't waste time hoping for a breeze. They built their own microclimates with whatever they had. Shade wasn't luck. It was strategy. Let's talk about goat hair, a material that somehow became both a construction material and a survival strategy. Not something you typically expect from goats, who otherwise spend most of their lives eating anything that isn't nailed down. To the Bedouins, goat hair wasn't just fluff, it was technology. Spun into thick, durable yarn, it became the fabric of their tents, the famous black tents of the desert. And believe it or not, these were far more than primitive shelters. They were the Swiss Army knives of the Arabian Peninsula, minus the corkscrew attachment. Here's the genius of it. When it's dry, goat hair lets air pass through, which is a blessing in heat that can peel paint off a rock. But when it rains, yes, occasionally the sky does remember how to cry. The fibres swell up, closing the weave and keeping water out. It's like automatic tent insurance, with zero paperwork. This dual-purpose miracle fabric meant that the tents stayed cool and breezy during the day, and dry and cosy when the rare storm hit. And because the desert cools rapidly at night, like a microwave that shuts off mid-cycle, the thick black material helped trap what little heat was left. But it's not just about the fabric, it's the design too. These tents were low, wind-resistant, and could be assembled and disassembled faster than a modern pop-up gazebo, by people who were likely also wrangling camels and keeping small children from wandering into sand dunes. The inside was divided by gender and function, one side for men and guests, another for women and family life. And while the tent was open at the sides to let air flow, cloth panels could be dropped in a flash when a sandstorm came knocking. Bedouins were masters of comfort within extreme limits, sort of like camping if your campground were actively trying to murder you. So no, it wasn't a palace. But in a place where the environment is actively hostile to human existence, the goat hair tent was both refuge and fortress. Now let's address a question every tourist has asked in the desert while wearing shorts and rapidly turning into a rotisserie chicken. Why are they wearing all those clothes? Welcome to the Bedouin robe, also known as the dishdasha, thobe, or galabaya, depending on the region. To the untrained eye, it may look like someone gave up on tailoring, but to the Bedouins, it's a thermal regulation masterpiece, carefully designed to outwit one of the most relentless suns on Earth. First, the fabric, usually light-coloured cotton or linen, not thick, not heavy, but loose and billowing, creating a layer of air between skin and heat, like having a personal breeze trapped under your clothes. And unlike your unfortunate tank top, it actually protects the skin from direct sunlight. Think of it as wearing your own shade. While most people in the desert are trying to sweat less, Bedouins let the sweat happen, because as it evaporates under those layers, it cools the body more efficiently than any desperate blast from a handheld fan. Bonus? It keeps sand from rubbing your legs raw, because nothing ruins a romantic camel ride like exfoliation by wind. Their headwear, like the keffiyeh or shamar, isn't just fashion either. It's a portable shelter. Wrapped around the head and face, it shields from sun, dust and sandstorms. It's adaptable, breathable, and stylish in a, yes, I might own a dagger and a deep understanding of the desert kind of way. Even the colours matter. White reflects sunlight. Black is actually used for tents more than clothing, although some tribes did wear darker hues in winter. But trust me, no one's wearing neon activewear out there, unless they're trying to get spotted by satellites. If you think waking up early is tough, try doing it because the sun is actively plotting your destruction. The Bedouins weren't morning people by preference. They were morning people by survival strategy. In the desert, timing is everything. The heat doesn't ramp up gently. It slaps you across the face sometime after 9 a.m. and doesn't let up until sunset. So, Bedouins became masters of desert scheduling, rising before dawn to travel, rest during the inferno hours of midday, and continue again in the cooler twilight. Modern tourists call this siesta. Bedouins call it not dying on the road. They didn't march across dunes at noon just to prove a point. That's how you end up dizzy, dehydrated, and hallucinating mirages that try to sell you bottled water. Instead, they'd set up camp, find shade, sip tea. Yes, hot tea. We'll get to that. And let the sun do its worst, while they quietly ignored it. Even the camels knew the drill. No panicked galloping, no dramatic desert sprints, just calm, steady pacing, like they were strolling to a mildly urgent appointment. There was no prize for speed, only for not collapsing face first into sand. And then there's navigation. Travelling early or late means knowing where you're going when everything looks the same. Bedouins didn't use compasses. They used stars, shadows, and a memory so sharp it could probably recite dune patterns by name. They knew how to avoid rocky valleys that trapped heat, where the sand was softest, and which terrain was more slow bake versus deep fry. They knew when to detour, when to climb, and when to say, nope, not today, and wait it out under a goat hair tent. To outsiders, their pace looked slow, but in reality, it was the rhythm of survival. Rushing meant sweating more, losing water faster, and risking heat stroke. Steady movement meant you made it to the next well, village, or shady tree with enough energy to actually enjoy being alive. You can't talk about Bedouin survival without addressing the real star of the show, the camel. These beasts didn't just survive the desert, they made it look easy. Camels are like the desert edition of a Swiss army knife. Transportation, shade, milk factory, early warning system, and occasional attitude problem, all wrapped in a furry, knobbly package. To the untrained eye, camels appear grumpy, lopsided, and mildly inconvenienced by existence. But to the Bedouins, they were life partners. A Bedouin without a camel was just a guy standing in a heat wave wondering why his feet hurt. First of all, camels can go days, sometimes weeks, without water. This isn't a party trick, it's an evolutionary superpower. Their bodies store fat in their humps, not water, contrary to popular belief. And they regulate sweat better than most fitness influencers. While you're melting under the sun like a cheap popsicle, camels are strolling past with an expression that basically says, amateur. Their feet? Massive and padded, perfect for walking across hot sand without sinking in or sizzling like bacon. Their nostrils. They can close them during sandstorms. That's right. Camels can literally shut out the desert. Try doing that with your local pollen count. And their milk? Nutrient-rich, slightly salty, and consumed even when there's no refrigeration in sight. It was breakfast, lunch, and electrolyte replacement therapy all in one. Bedouins used camels not just to carry supplies, but also to locate water. These animals had a sixth sense for survival. If a camel suddenly perked up and turned left, you followed, even if your internal GPS disagreed. But owning a camel wasn't like having a pet. It was more like having a temperamental co-worker who occasionally spits at you, but can also save your life. Bedouins respected their camels, talked to them, named them, and treated them better than some modern folks treat their internet routers. Picture this. It's midday in the desert. The sun is hanging overhead like a heat lamp from a particularly angry god. Your sweat is sweating. Logic says, water, ice, something cold, please. But the Bedouin response? Let's have some piping hot tea. Yes, you heard that right. In the middle of an oven made of sand and regret, the Bedouins drank boiling hot tea. And not as some ironic joke. It was an actual survival strategy, a thermodynamic plot twist that would baffle your average air-conditioned Westerner. Here's the logic, and it's backed by both tradition and physics. Drinking hot liquids signals your body to cool itself down. You begin sweating, which is your natural air conditioning system. And when that sweat evaporates in the dry desert air, it cools the body far more effectively than chugging cold water and waiting for your internal organs to do something useful. Also, unlike cold water, which can give you cramps and make you feel bloated when you're already dehydrated, tea goes down smooth and encourages measured hydration, sip by sip. No guzzling, no brain freeze, just calm efficiency with a touch of elegance. And it wasn't just tea. Sometimes it was salted tea or herbal infusions made from local desert plants. Things like sage or chamomile. These weren't luxury blends from a high-end boutique. They were practical concoctions that replaced electrolytes and soothed the gut. especially useful when your kitchen was a campfire and your fridge was a rock. Tea was more than hydration. It was ritual. The desert has a way of stripping life down to the essentials, and the tea circle was one of the few luxuries the Bedouins kept. Hospitality, storytelling, trade negotiations. It all happened over hot cups and clinking spoons, and in a world where survival meant embracing discomfort and mastering your own body heat, the act of sipping tea under a blazing sun wasn't madness. It was control, dignity, a little middle finger to the sun. In the desert, water isn't a casual refreshment. It's a VIP guest, a sacred commodity, and occasionally a cause for tribal conflict. While most people today think of water as something that comes out of the fridge in a nice bottle with a mountain on the label, the Bedouins viewed it the way a medieval king viewed gold, precious, guarded, and never wasted. The Bedouins weren't just surviving without abundant water, they were thriving with practically none. And the secret wasn't mystical desert powers, it was meticulous planning and an unbreakable code of respect for water. First off, they knew where to find it. In a landscape that looks like an endless, sand-coloured photocopy, Bedouins could spot subtle clues, a certain plant, a line of birds, the shape of the terrain, and say, "There's a well over that dune." And 9 times out of 10, they were right. That one time they were wrong? Let's just say it probably ended with a camel giving them the side-eye. They dug deep wells, tapped into underground springs, and even captured condensation in cloth overnight. Nothing was wasted. You didn't pour one out for the homies in Bedouin culture unless you really liked them. Drinking water wasn't a free-for-all. It was rationed carefully, especially during travel. You drank just enough, not more. Think hydrated monk rather than festival goer with a gallon jug. Overdrinking could actually make you thirstier in the long run by flushing essential salts. Hence, that salty tea from Chapter 7 wasn't just weird, it was strategic. Water also had a powerful social value. Sharing water with travellers was a moral obligation, not a nice gesture. To deny someone water in the desert was basically the nomadic version of slamming the door in a blizzard, and possibly starting a blood feud. Even enemies were often offered water before negotiations began. The desert didn't care who you were. Dehydration was famously non-partisan. Imagine this. You're sitting by your tent, sipping tea, having a calm chat with your camel, when suddenly the horizon vanishes. The sky turns yellowish-brown, and before you can say, "Did someone anger the weather spirits?" you're being violently exfoliated by the wind. Welcome to the charming world of sandstorms, or as Bedouins likely called them, Tuesday. In the desert, sandstorms aren't rare freak events. They're a regular feature of life, like sunburns or unsolicited camel opinions. For most people, a sandstorm would send them into panic mode, screaming about dust in their nostrils and the general unfairness of nature. But for the Bedouins, it was just another situation to outsmart, preferably without losing a goat. The first rule of surviving a sandstorm is don't run around flapping. The Bedouins had a plan, and it started with situational awareness. They could often see a storm coming long before it hit. A strange tint to the light, a sudden shift in wind, that eerie moment when the desert goes too quiet. All warning signs. Next came the tent lockdown. Bedouin tents were open at the sides for airflow, but once a storm kicked up, out came the side flaps, weighted cloth panels that dropped faster than modern blinds in a rental apartment. The goat hair did its job. Sand-resistant, breathable, and somehow always ready. And for those caught in the open, the keffiyeh, headscarf, was the unsung hero. In seconds, it became a sand-proof face shield, wrapped tightly across the mouth, nose, and eyes. Some even carried extra cloth just for emergency wrapping. Think DIY desert hazmat suit, minus the bulk. If absolutely nothing was nearby, a shallow trench in the sand offered temporary shelter. It wasn't glamorous, but neither is inhaling 5 pounds of the Sahara. Bedouins would lie flat, cover up, and wait it out, like desert ninjas, but gritty. The storm would pass, eventually. Afterward came the dusting off, checking the camels, and maybe a laugh about who got sand in the weirdest place. Spoiler, it's always the ears. To outsiders, sandstorms looked apocalyptic. To Bedouins, just another round of dermatological violence from the sky. But thanks to planning, patience, and practical scarves, they handled it like pros. When you live in an environment where cooking outside is redundant because the sun already does that for you, your food choices become less about flavour explosions and more about not exploding from heat exhaustion. The Bedouins knew this better than anyone. Their diet was not designed for indulgence. There were no 7-course meals, no deep-fried novelties, and certainly no midnight snack binges. Mostly because midnight snacks involve firewood, and firewood is rare when the trees gave up centuries ago. Instead, the Bedouin menu was built around 3 things: simplicity, sustainability, and survival. Let's start with the superstar, camel milk. It wasn't just a drink, it was a nutritional Swiss army knife. Full of fat, protein, vitamins, and hydration magic, camel milk was consumed fresh when possible, or fermented into a mildly fizzy yogurt-like drink called Laban. Not quite a milkshake, but in 110 Fahrenheit weather, it hit the spot. Dates were another staple. These sugary little energy bombs were lightweight, didn't spoil, and provided potassium, fibre, and a satisfying chew, like nature's version of trail mix, minus the questionable raisins. Bedouins often paired dates with milk, which was pretty much their version of dessert. Sweet, filling, and blessedly not covered in sand. Flatbreads were made when possible, quickly cooked on hot stones or simple pans over the fire. No crusty baguettes out here. Just functional, foldable carbs that could double as a plate or a makeshift napkin if things got out of hand. Meat, when eaten, was a rare occasion, usually linked to ceremonies, guests, or when a goat did something truly unforgivable. When it was prepared, it was cooked low and slow, sometimes underground in pit ovens. Spices were minimal. The seasoning was mostly salt, maybe, and we're grateful to be eating. Water wasn't gulped during meals. It was strategically sipped, usually after eating. You didn't want to dilute your stomach acids or risk wasting precious fluids on digestion. Yes, even the order of eating was optimized. You'd think after roasting all day, the desert would cut you some slack at night. But no. The sun might clock out, but the temperature doesn't cool down so much as it plummets like it tripped over its own robes. For the Bedouins, this meant learning to sleep between 2 extremes: oven by day, icebox by night. Forget feather beds and memory foam. Comfort was measured by how few bugs you swallowed while snoring with your mouth open. During the hotter months, Bedouins slept outside, under the stars, sometimes with nothing but a blanket and a prayer. But don't picture a romantic Instagram camping setup. Picture more like, let's lie very still and hope the wind remembers to show up. The trick was to sleep after sunset and before dawn, catching that precious window of relative coolness. The best beds? A soft patch of sand, a saddlebag for a pillow, and your camel parked nearby. For security, shade, and moral support. Nothing says sweet dreams like a grumpy animal chewing in the dark. But when it was truly blistering, midday naps became essential, not optional. You didn't push through the heat like some caffeine-chugging office worker trying to impress the boss. You laid down, closed your eyes, and submitted. It wasn't laziness. It was desert logic. In colder months, sleeping inside the goat hair tent became necessary, with thick blankets and extra layers. The same tent that breathed in the heat now became a toasty cocoon, unless the wind decided to throw a tantrum and whip sand into your face. Again, there were no bedtimes, only the understanding that sleep happened when it could, and often in shifts. Someone had to watch the fire. Someone had to watch the animals. Someone had to snore loud enough to keep the jackals second-guessing. No clocks. No alarms. Just moonlight, instinct, and the occasional cough from a nearby cousin. Let's be honest. Raising kids is hard enough with air conditioning and a fully stocked fridge. Now imagine doing it in the desert, where toys are rocks, playpen is a sand dune, and your toddler's first word might be camel. Bedouin children didn't get childhoods filled with plastic playsets and gluten-free snacks. They got something far more intense: heat-hardened life training starting roughly 5 minutes after birth. From a young age, Bedouin kids were expected to adapt to the desert, not the other way around. Swaddled tightly in cloth, yes, like adorable little burritos, they were protected from sun, sand, and unsolicited scorpion interactions. These wraps weren't just for comfort. They helped regulate temperature and kept limbs from flailing into hot surfaces. Functional and fashionable. But Bedouin parenting didn't hover. There were no helicopter parents, only camel-watching ones. Children learned by observation and imitation. They saw how water was handled like treasure, how clothing was adjusted to match the heat, and how to avoid stepping into a fire pit by simply not doing it twice. By the age of 5 or 6, they were helping with real tasks. Boys learned to care for camels and navigate terrain. Girls learned cooking, tent making, and how to pour tea without accidentally burning down the family circle. It wasn't just about chores, it was early survival internship. Play still happened, of course. Kids raced, wrestled, told stories, and likely invented elaborate games involving sticks and the occasional very confused goat. Their playground had no jungle gym, but it came with sand for days and the occasional windstorm to keep things exciting. Discipline was firm but fair. Survival required it. But affection was never far behind. Bedouin families were tight-knit, with every child raised not just by parents, but by the entire camp. Think of it as a very warm, very sandy village raising each child. No app notifications required. And through all this, kids learned the ultimate lesson. The desert doesn't forgive, but it respects those who learn its rhythm. In most places, hospitality means offering coffee and pretending your house is always that clean. In the desert, it means offering survival, even to strangers who might have insulted your cousin 3 trade routes ago. For the Bedouins, hospitality wasn't optional. It was a sacred code, older than most of the dunes they walked on. In a place where the environment could roast you alive before breakfast, turning someone away could be a death sentence, and no one wanted that kind of karma on their camel. Guests, whether invited, unexpected, or mysteriously vague about their intentions, were always welcomed. The first thing offered? Shade. Because in the desert, shade is basically air conditioning with no electricity bill. A guest would be brought under the tent, seated on cushions, and offered water or tea before a single question was asked. You didn't grill them about their business while they were still sweating like a goat in July. Next came the food. Even if supplies were low, the guest was fed. Dates, flatbread, and sometimes meat, though that was usually reserved for truly special visitors, like elders, dignitaries, or your cousin finally returning the camel he borrowed 3 months ago. And then came the tea ceremony, slow, deliberate, and filled with meaningful silences. The clinking of cups, the pouring of hot tea, the passing of the pot. It all created a rhythm, like verbal jazz played on a brass kettle. It wasn't just refreshment, it was a diplomatic ritual. Hospitality wasn't limited to just individuals. Entire tribes had reputations based on their generosity. A stingy host could bring shame, while a generous one gained honour, alliances, and probably a few future favours, because the desert always pays back in unexpected ways. And yes, even enemies were sometimes given water and rest, with grudges politely set aside until at least after the 3rd cup of tea. The code demanded it. After all, you can't feud if everyone's unconscious from heat stroke. To the Bedouins, hospitality was more than manners. It was mutual survival, a shared understanding that the desert didn't care who you were, but a kind host just might save your life, and all it cost was a little water, a little shade, and your best cup of tea. When the sun finally dipped behind the dunes, and the desert cooled from lava to toasty rock, it was storytelling time. And no, not the once-upon-a-time kind with dragons and castles. Bedouin stories were gritty, clever, and usually involved someone outwitting a rival with a goat and a handful of dates. There were no screens, no subscriptions, no buffering wheels. Just a small fire crackling in the sand, a circle of tired travellers, and that one guy who definitely exaggerated the ending every time. Storytelling was more than entertainment. It was memory management. The Bedouins didn't write things down. Why waste paper you didn't have when you had a brain full of desert legends, tribal lineages, star maps, and jokes that had aged like fine camel cheese? Children learned history not from textbooks, but from grandmothers who could recite entire genealogies backwards while spinning yarn or sipping tea. They knew who betrayed whom 3 generations ago, and they could describe it with dramatic pauses and just enough scandal to keep the kids wide-eyed and suspicious of the neighbours. Every tribe had its own library of tales, tales of survival, loss, honour, love, and the occasional poetic revenge. There were heroes, tricksters, wise elders, and cursed wells, all passed down through voice, rhythm, and dramatic eyebrow gestures. And because desert life involved a lot of sitting and waiting for the heat to pass, for the stars to rise, for that stubborn camel to move, stories were the original time filler. No one stared at a glowing screen while ignoring their family. They stared at each other, which was arguably more terrifying. Storytelling also helped preserve survival knowledge. Where to find water, which plants to avoid, how to calm a panicked animal, all wrapped in metaphor, rhyme, and the occasional cautionary tale about a reckless uncle named Nasser the Sweaty. The modern world has this charming delusion that nature must be conquered. Build higher walls, stronger AC units, thicker sunscreen. But the Bedouins, they understood something far more elegant. You don't fight the desert. You learn its rhythm and walk beside it. For centuries, Bedouin life was built not on opposition, but on adaptation. Instead of paving over the sand, they floated on top of it, like surfers of heat and grit. Their tents moved with the seasons, their routines shifted with the sun, and their patience stretched farther than the horizon. They didn't wear black robes in the heat because they were rebelling against common sense. They wore them because airflow matters. Their goats weren't random livestock. They were compact survival machines with hooves. Even their jewellery served functions, sometimes as dowry, sometimes as emergency barter. Nothing was just decoration. It all had purpose. Bedouins didn't curse the sandstorms. They read them. They didn't rush through the day. They paced it. Morning was for movement, noon was for stillness, evening was for tea and stories. It wasn't laziness. It was climate literacy. Even their conflicts, fierce as they could be, were handled with layers of honour and negotiation. Because when you live in an unforgiving landscape, burning bridges is a terrible survival strategy. Their understanding of the land was passed not through apps, but through practice. Want to learn where the water hides? Walk with someone older. Want to navigate a moonless night? Watch how the stars shift. No shortcuts, just lived experience and respect. Today, we build deserts into cities and pretend we've won. But the Bedouins would say, gently, with a knowing smirk, that you don't win against the desert. You earn your place in it, one day at a time. So, as the sun sinks and the wind carries the scent of dust and distant tea, remember, true survival isn't about resisting nature's power. It's about knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to sit down and sip your tea before the sand decides to join you. Because in the desert, the heat doesn't care about your ego, but it just might respect your humility. She wasn't born into silk sheets or domed palaces, far from it. Sometime around 1502, in the rugged lands of Ruthenia, likely in what is now western Ukraine, a young girl named Alexandra Lisowska lived the simple life of a Christian peasant. Her days were filled with chores, laughter, and the lullabies of the Carpathians. But fate, as it often does in empires, had other plans. Raiders, likely Crimean Tatars allied with the Ottoman slave trade, tore her away from that world before she was old enough to understand just how brutal history could be. Dragged from her village and forced into the long chain of slaves bound for the bustling markets of Istanbul, Alexandra was now property. Her beauty caught the attention of those who trafficked in flesh, but it was something far more dangerous that would soon define her: her mind. In the early 16th century, the Ottoman harem wasn't the erotic playground of Hollywood fantasies. It was a political battlefield. And Alexandra, renamed Hurrem, meaning the cheerful one, was about to play the game better than anyone before her. She entered the harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful man in the Islamic world. He ruled an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, and from the Danube to the Nile. And yet, despite the thousands of concubines and consorts before her, it was this foreign slave girl who would catch his eye and never let go. There are conflicting reports on how exactly she rose. Some say it was her laughter, rare and irreverent in the shadowed corridors of Topkapi Palace. Others say it was her command of poetry, wit and language. She was fluent in multiple tongues and knew how to charm, disarm, and enchant. Either way, Suleiman didn't just favour her. He fell for her, but Hurrem didn't come to play the passive muse. Her rise wasn't an accident. It was a masterclass in strategy, timing, and sheer will. She would rewrite the rules of Ottoman court politics, starting with herself. From slave to consort, that was just the beginning. In the world of the Ottoman harem, beauty was fleeting, and attention even more so. A girl might catch the Sultan's eye for a week, maybe a month, but then she would vanish into velvet shadows, replaced by the next shimmering novelty. But Hurrem didn't vanish. She lingered, and not by accident. Suleiman, known for his keen intellect and poetic spirit, found an equal in her. They wrote love letters to each other. Yes, actual handwritten poetry, draped in metaphors and dripping with longing. She called him her beloved sultan, and he called her his companion of the soul. This was no casual affair. It was a romance that defied protocol. At this time, Ottoman sultans were not supposed to marry. The imperial harem had a system. A woman bore the sultan a son, and then she was retired to a provincial palace to oversee his upbringing. It prevented any one woman from gaining too much power. That rule, Hurrem shattered it. Not only did she stay in the palace, she gave birth to multiple children, sons and daughters, and never stepped aside. She became his official favourite, then his exclusive partner. And then the unthinkable happened. Suleiman legally married her. That's right, the most powerful Islamic emperor of his time, who had the pick of any concubine, took a former Christian slave girl as his lawful wife. This was the first imperial marriage in centuries. The court was scandalized. The ulama, the religious establishment, grumbled behind their beards. But Suleiman didn't care. Hurrem was now Haseki Sultan, the chief consort. She wielded an authority no woman before her ever had. The harem wasn't just a place she lived in. It became her headquarters. Whispers grew louder. Was she manipulating the Sultan? Was she whispering into his ear before every major decision? The janissaries, the viziers, even foreign ambassadors took note. Letters and reports began to refer to her as a shadow figure shaping Ottoman policy, and she hadn't even begun her real power moves yet. The harem walls could not contain what Hurrem Sultan was becoming. She wasn't just rewriting palace politics. She was positioning herself at the very heart of empire. In the Ottoman Empire, giving birth to a sultan's son wasn't just a blessing, it was a weapon, and Hurrem knew how to wield it. Her first son, Mehmed, was born not long after she secured Suleiman's affection. Then came Mihrima, her only daughter and closest confidant. Soon followed Selim, Bayezid, Jihangir. With every birth, her power solidified, each child a pawn on the grand imperial chessboard. But this wasn't just about family. It was about succession and survival. You see, Ottoman succession didn't work like the fairy tale version. There was no clear heir. Instead, it was a brutal, winner-takes-all blood sport. When a sultan died, his sons were expected to fight, often literally, for the throne. And the losers? They didn't go quietly into exile. They were usually strangled with a silk cord. It was tradition. That meant for Hurrem, the stakes were existential. She wasn't just a mother. She was the general of a faction, fighting to ensure that her sons survived the coming storm. And there was one major obstacle. Mustafa. Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son from a previous concubine, Mahidevran, was beloved by the people, the army, and the court. Charismatic, popular, and competent, he looked like the obvious successor. That made him dangerous, to Hurrem, and more importantly, to her children. The rivalry between Hurrem and Mahidevran wasn't some catfight in silks. It was an all-out war. There were physical altercations. It's recorded that Mahidevran once beat Hurrem so badly that she appeared in front of Suleiman with scratches and bruises. That move backfired. Mahidevran was banished from court, while Hurrem's influence only grew. Behind the scenes, Hurrem played the game like a seasoned tactician. She cultivated allies in the court, including the powerful Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, who would eventually marry her daughter Mirima. She also began writing letters to foreign rulers, including the Polish king, acting as a diplomat in her own right. And most chilling of all, rumours swirled that Hurrem was plotting Mustafa's downfall. Whether or not she orchestrated it, the seeds were planted. The empire was heading toward a deadly confrontation. Motherhood, for Hurrem Sultan, was not just sacred, it was strategic. It was the scandal that shook the empire. By the 1550s, the rivalry between Prince Mustafa and Hurrem Sultan had become more than palace gossip. It was a ticking time bomb. Mustafa had grown into a strong, capable leader. He was charismatic, militarily successful, and beloved by the Janissaries. More importantly, many believed he should be the next sultan, and that posed an existential threat, not just to Hurrem, but to her sons. What happened next has divided historians for centuries. According to many accounts, Hurrem and her son-in-law, Rustem Pasha, who conveniently held the position of Grand Vizier, began a slow, deliberate campaign of suspicion. Whispers reached Suleiman's ears. Mustafa was plotting to overthrow his father. Letters were forged, spies were planted. The suggestion was clear: act now or risk betrayal. Suleiman, tormented by doubt, summoned Mustafa during the Persian campaign of 1553. The prince arrived at his father's tent in full ceremonial dress, bowing low in respect. What happened next was not ceremonial. The royal guard seized Mustafa, and in a cold silence, they strangled him with a silk bowstring, the traditional execution method for Ottoman royalty. Witnesses said Suleiman watched from behind a curtain, his face unreadable. The reaction across the empire was seismic. The Janissaries, who adored Mustafa, were outraged. The public wept for their fallen prince. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in disbelief. And at the heart of it all, a familiar name surfaced again and again: Hurrem. Whether she orchestrated Mustafa's death or merely benefited from it, her power was now unshakable. Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother, was effectively exiled, living the rest of her life in bitter obscurity. Meanwhile, Hurrem's sons, especially Selim, were now the only viable contenders for the throne. But not all was calm within her own brood. Hurrem's sons fought among themselves, plagued by their own ambitions and insecurities. And Suleiman, the sultan who once wrote love poetry and enacted reforms, was becoming colder, more isolated, perhaps haunted by what he had done. Mustafa's death marked the beginning of the end for the idealistic days of Suleiman's reign, and solidified Hurrem's place in history not just as a queen, but as a kingmaker, or perhaps a queen-slayer. By now, Hurrem Sultan was no longer just the Sultan's favourite. She was the most powerful woman in the empire. But unlike queens in Europe, she didn't sit beside Suleiman on a throne. Her influence came from behind embroidered curtains, whispered through silk screens and penned in coded letters. She was the architect of what would later be called the Sultanate of Women. a political era where imperial mothers, wives and daughters shaped the Ottoman state. She had already defied centuries of precedent by marrying Suleiman, bearing him multiple sons, and remaining in the palace. Now she broke another. She moved out of the harem and into the old palace section of Topkapi, closer to the administrative heart of the empire, and dangerously close to the seat of power. From this base, Hürrem acted as an informal advisor. She wrote to foreign monarchs like Sigismund II of Poland, not as a concubine, but as a sovereign partner. Her letters were diplomatic, assertive, and stunningly literate. She wasn't just the power behind the throne, she was a throne of sorts. She also spearheaded public works in Istanbul and Jerusalem. Mosques, schools, soup kitchens, hospitals, all stamped with her name. This wasn't just charity, it was image control. While her enemies painted her as a manipulative temptress, she painted herself as a patron of the poor and protector of Islam. And still, despite her rise, she never ruled publicly. She understood the rules and bent them without breaking them. No royal decrees bore her signature. No official documents listed her as a ruler. But ministers deferred to her. Pashas courted her favour. And Suleiman? He relied on her counsel more than on any vizier. Of course, none of this went unnoticed. European ambassadors wrote home calling her the witch, the red-haired devil, the poison of the empire. And yet they admitted in hushed tones, without her, the Ottoman court would collapse into chaos. She didn't wear a crown, but her shadow fell across the empire like one. And still, time marched forward. Her sons were growing older, tensions rising. The empire she had helped stabilize might soon devour itself from within. And Hürrem, ever the strategist, knew the game wasn't over. Power, once gained, rarely brings peace. Hürrem Sultan may have vanquished her rivals and secured her position beside Suleiman, but the battlefield simply changed shape. Now it was her own sons who stood at the edge of knives, and each other. Her eldest, Mehmed, once seen as the favoured heir, died young under suspicious, though likely natural, circumstances. The grief was immense, but there was no time to mourn. The throne had to pass to someone, and that meant the rest of her sons, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, would soon be pitted against one another in a silent, bloodless war that would turn bloody fast. Selim, known more for his drinking than his diplomacy, was not the most inspiring candidate, but he was cautious and obedient, traits Suleiman valued. Bayezid, on the other hand, was ambitious, charismatic, and perhaps too much like his late half-brother Mustafa. That resemblance would prove fatal. Hürrem's letters during this time show a woman trying desperately to balance loyalty, love, and raw political calculus. She tried to keep peace between her sons, encouraging unity, trying to nudge the empire toward a smooth succession. But she knew the truth. Only one could survive. And then there was Cihangir, her youngest, born with a spinal deformity. Physically frail, emotionally tender, he was never in the running for the throne. Yet he may have been the one Hürrem loved most. After Mustafa's execution, Cihangir reportedly died of heartbreak. Whether that's legend or truth, it added another crack in the already fractured family she'd worked so hard to protect. The death of Mustafa had set a precedent. Fratricide was not just tradition, it was necessary. And now, Hürrem was watching her own blood march toward that same inevitable violence. It was a cruel irony. She had spent her life climbing out of powerlessness, only to become trapped in a cycle of blood that no mother could bear. She had built a dynasty, but dynasties are hungry creatures, and in the corridors of Topkapi, where she had once arrived in chains, she now paced in fine silks, still strategizing, still fighting. But for a future she could no longer fully control. Time was slipping, and with it, the illusion that anyone in the palace was safe. As the empire trembled under the weight of internal rivalries, Hürrem Sultan turned her eyes to something more enduring than politics: legacy. She had always understood that power was fleeting, but monuments. Those could whisper her name long after her enemies turned to dust. So, while her sons plotted and Suleiman brooded in his increasingly somber court, Hurrem became a patron of public works on a scale few women, or men, could dream of. She commissioned the Haseki Sultan complex in Istanbul, a sprawling architectural marvel that included a mosque, school, hospital, and soup kitchen. It wasn't just a gift to the people, it was a message carved in stone. I was here. I mattered. I served something bigger than court intrigue. She also funded repairs in Jerusalem, helped restore public baths and fountains, and supported charitable endowments that fed and clothed the poor. Every act of generosity was also an act of calculated PR. After all, Hurrem had been slandered endlessly, painted as a sorceress, a schemer, a foreign seductress who bent a mighty sultan to her will. Her building projects were a counter-narrative, one of grace, service, and piety. And yet, for all the grandeur, she remained controversial. The Ottoman elite never forgave her for upending centuries of tradition. Even ordinary citizens, who benefited from her charity, debated her intentions. Was she a noble benefactor or a master manipulator? A feminist icon ahead of her time? Or a ruthless power broker cloaked in beauty? Even within the palace, her influence had limits. Suleiman remained loyal, but increasingly burdened by age, grief, and the failures of his surviving sons. The romantic poetry between them faded, replaced by official matters and bureaucratic fatigue. Still, Hurrem worked until the very end, not just for herself, but for the dynasty she had restructured from within. She wasn't content to be remembered as the Sultan's beloved. She wanted to be remembered as someone who reshaped the very idea of what a woman could be in an empire ruled by men. As time narrowed her world, she ensured the next generation, especially her daughter Mihrima, would inherit not just jewellery and titles, but a roadmap for power. By the late 1550s, the woman once dragged in chains through the slave markets of Istanbul now lay in silken sheets, surrounded by doctors, attendants, and political whispers. Hurrem Sultan was aging, and for the first time in decades no longer the dominant presence at court. The harem was quieter without her sharp mind steering its intrigues. The correspondence with foreign rulers slowed. Her once burning ambitions had given way to something more reflective, a desire to secure the future before death could unwrite her influence. But there was a problem. The empire she had spent her life moulding was fraying at the edges. Selim, her surviving son and favourite for succession, was hardly the image of imperial strength. Known for his fondness for wine and poetry, Selim lacked the charisma of Mustafa, the cunning of Bayezid, or even the spiritual depth of Cihangir. Still, he was loyal to her, and most importantly, alive. Bayezid, the more popular and dangerous of the two, had been driven to rebellion. With Suleiman's approval, and perhaps Hurrem's encouragement before her health declined, Bayezid had been hunted down and executed in Persia. The path was now clear for Selim, but it was a grim victory, soaked in familial blood. Hurrem had spent her youth surviving violence, her adulthood controlling it, and now her final years watching it unfold inside her own family. She died in 1558, several years before Suleiman. She never lived to see her son crowned as Selim II, nor did she witness the slow decline of the empire she helped shape. But she left behind a transformed dynasty, one where women would continue to wield real political power for generations. Her funeral was grand. She was buried in a mausoleum right beside Suleiman's eventual tomb, in the Suleymaniye mosque complex she helped inspire. That, too, was unheard of. No concubine, no woman, had ever been honoured in this way. Even in death, she defied tradition. Hurrem Sultan's story ended not with a scandal or assassination, but with a quiet assertion of permanence. She may have entered the empire as a commodity, but she left it as an institution. And yet, even in the quiet, history was far from done with her. Long after her body was laid to rest in marble and tile, Hurrem Sultan's legacy refused to die. To some, she remained the ultimate femme fatale, the foreign sorceress who bewitched a great sultan and plunged an empire into dynastic chaos. European diplomats in their letters called her the Russian witch, or that red-haired schemer. Even centuries later, Ottoman chroniclers debated her true nature, with some blaming her for everything from military defeats to political instability. But others saw her differently. Modern historians have begun to reassess Hurrem not as a villain, but as a political genius, a survivor who played a brutal game in a brutal world and won. She wasn't simply a concubine, she was the founder of a new political paradigm. Her life marked the beginning of the Kadınlar Sultanate, the Sultanate of Women, a century-long period during which women, mothers, wives and daughters of sultans, exerted real power over state affairs. Her daughter Mihrima would become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, acting as an advisor to both her father and her brother, Selim. Other imperial women would follow Hurrem's blueprint, maneuvering from behind veils, shaping the empire not with swords, but with strategy, charity and influence. Even Suleiman, long after her death, couldn't let her go. His poetry never stopped referencing his Hurrem, his joy. When he died in 1566, he was buried next to her, a decision that, once again, broke Ottoman precedent. He had ruled for nearly 46 years, the longest of any sultan. And yet, in the end, he chose to lie forever beside a woman who had once been his slave. Today, visitors to the Süleymaniye Mosque can still see their tombs, side by side, elegant and eternal. The irony is rich. The woman who arrived in shackles now rests beside the most powerful man in the Islamic world as his equal. Love her or loathe her, Hurrem Sultan reshaped the Ottoman Empire. She bent centuries of tradition to her will. And she proved more than anything else that power does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it smiles behind a curtain with eyes like fire and a plan already in motion. In Byzantium, a marriage didn't begin with candlelit dinners or whispered vows. It began with paperwork, cold, calculated, and surprisingly binding. The betrothal, called engesis, was more legal transaction than love story. If you were expecting violins and blushing maidens, you're in the wrong empire. The process began with negotiations between families. Not between bride and groom, mind you. They were often teenagers, sometimes barely acquainted. The real power players were the fathers, or if the groom was of high enough status, the imperial court itself. This wasn't just about uniting two people. It was about uniting property, influence, and bloodlines. Once both sides agreed to the terms, dowry, property rights, family obligations, the betrothal was sealed in front of witnesses, and not lightly. It was legally binding. Breaking off an engesis without good reason could trigger lawsuits, scandal, and the wrath of bishops. In some cases, the church required formal annulment of the betrothal, even though the couple hadn't married yet. And what about the bride during all this? She had little say. Byzantine daughters were raised to serve the will of the family, not chase romance. Marriage was seen as a duty, spiritual, social, and economic. But while the bride's voice was often silent, her body was central. Virginity was expected, and proof of chastity was often part of the negotiation. A tarnished reputation could doom a match before it began. As the betrothal was finalized, gifts were exchanged, symbols of the coming union. Rings, robes, sometimes even livestock, depending on one's social status. But this wasn't the actual wedding. Not yet. This was the staging ground, the setting of the chessboard. The real ceremony, the gamos, could be weeks or months away. The betrothal wasn't just a prelude. It was a contract of intent, a declaration of status, and in many cases, a strategic move, especially among the elite. Marriages weren't about affection. They were about alliance. A noble family might marry their daughter into a powerful military clan, securing troops for future political struggles. A merchant might trade a dowry for access to imperial trade routes. Love? That came later, if you were lucky. In Byzantium, a daughter was never just a daughter. She was also a dowry in waiting. The moment a girl was born into a Byzantine family, her value wasn't measured in lullabies or bedtime stories. It was calculated in land, linens and coin. Marriage wasn't just a social expectation, it was a full-blown economic strategy. The dowry, or proax, was the bride's ticket into marriage, and often her only protection within it. This wasn't pocket change. For the aristocracy, it might include gold, silver, silk, slaves and country estates. For middle-class families, it was often practical. Household furnishings, clothing, maybe a modest amount of cash. But no matter the size, the message was the same. Here is our daughter, and here's what she brings to your house. This wasn't some medieval generosity. The dowry was a kind of marital insurance policy. If the husband died or abandoned her, not unheard of in politically motivated unions, she had a claim to her dowry. It was hers by law. Sort of. As long as no one powerful contested it, and as long as she didn't rock the boat too hard. For wealthy and noble families, the dowry wasn't just protection, it was a weapon. With it, they could forge alliances, curry favour with the imperial court, or buy their way into influence. A well-endowed daughter could be married off to a general to secure military protection, or to a civil official to grease political wheels. Daughters were deployed like pawns on a marble board, some to marry, some to join monasteries, and a very lucky few to catch the emperor's eye. Of course, this all placed tremendous pressure on families. If a family had several daughters, the financial burden could be crushing. Fathers were often forced to divide their estates just to get all their girls married off. Unless, of course, they quietly shuffled one off into a convent instead. But dowries weren't just financial tools. They were also status markers. A bride entering her husband's home came bearing not just silver, but pride. Her family's wealth displayed like a walking advertisement. No pressure, right? And so, before the veils, before the crowns, before the church bells rang, it was the dowry that made or broke the Byzantine bride. If the betrothal was the business meeting and the dowry the transaction, then the wedding itself was the show. And what a show it was. A Byzantine wedding wasn't just a private affair. It was a public performance of unity, class, and religious legitimacy. For the elite, it could span multiple days, with carefully choreographed rituals that blended Roman pomp, Christian sanctity, and Eastern opulence. Even among commoners, the wedding day was a spectacle. The more elaborate, the more respectable. The bride would begin her transformation with ritual baths and grooming, her hair braided with care, adorned with gold, pearls, or ribbons, depending on her station. In wealthier circles, attendants might dress her in layers of silk robes, veils, and embroidered slippers. Modesty was expected, but make no mistake. This was about display. You were dressing the family name. The groom too had his own ceremonial preparations, but let's be honest, all eyes were on the bride. Once ready, the bride was escorted through the streets to the church, a procession that was both sacred and strategic. Everyone had to see it. Musicians played, relatives wept, or pretended to, and the entire neighbourhood lined the streets for a glimpse. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a parade of reputation. And then came the church ceremony. The gamos. It was solemn, slow, and deeply symbolic. The couple would stand before the priest, hands joined, as prayers and psalms were chanted. But the crown jewel of the ritual, literally, was the crowning. Golden or ornate wreaths were placed on both the bride and groom's heads, symbolizing not just marital union, but martyrdom. Yes, martyrdom. In Byzantine theology, marriage wasn't just about love, it was a kind of sacred suffering, a life of mutual sacrifice. Congratulations, you're now king and queen of your tiny domestic kingdom. Enjoy your symbolic death. Candles were held, prayers recited. The couple was walked around the altar 3 times in a slow ceremonial circle, a dance of eternity if you like metaphors, and finally they were declared husband and wife. But don't exhale just yet, because what followed was often even more intense. The procession home, the feasting, and the strange and specific rituals of the bridal chamber. The wedding wasn't over, it was just getting started. If the wedding ceremony was a public ritual of holiness and status, the wedding night was, well, also kind of public, just in a far more awkward way. In the Byzantine Empire, the consummation of a marriage wasn't just a private moment between 2 newlyweds. It was a critical requirement to finalize the union, and yes, people kept track. A marriage wasn't truly considered valid until it was consummated. This made the first night a matter of legal, familial, and sometimes political importance. After the church ceremony, the couple was escorted, again, often publicly, to the groom's home or a designated chamber. This was called the nuptial procession. Along the way, torchbearers and musicians might accompany them, chanting hymns or playing flutes. If it sounds like a victory parade, that's because it kind of was. The couple had successfully made it to this point, and now came the moment everyone pretended not to obsess over. In some elite households, attendants or family members, yes, awkwardly, remained nearby to ensure everything went as expected. In rare cases, confirmation of consummation was documented, a blood-stained sheet shown discreetly to elders as proof. It's worth noting this was more common in higher-ranking households where inheritance and legitimacy mattered deeply. But not all was grim and clinical. There were blessings to be spoken, candles to be lit, and symbolic food like bread and wine placed nearby. Reminders of fertility, prosperity, and spiritual unity. The crowns used in the church ceremony were sometimes placed beside the bed or hung above it as a sign of divine favour. And depending on the region and family tradition, songs or chants might be performed outside the room. A strange combination of privacy and performance. For the bride, this night was often filled with anxiety. She might be very young, possibly married to a much older man, and expected to transition instantly from obedient daughter to competent wife. For the groom, it was a test of masculinity and authority. The stakes were high for both, emotionally, socially, and in terms of their family's reputation. And if consummation didn't happen, the marriage could be annulled, just like that. In Byzantium, the wedding night wasn't the start of a honeymoon. It was a test. One with candles, crowns, and a lot of watching eyes. Once the couple had survived the solemnity of the ceremony and the nerves of the wedding night, it was time for the Byzantines to do what they secretly did best, throw a proper feast. The wedding banquet wasn't just a party. It was a statement. Especially for noble or imperial families, the post-wedding feast was where alliances were sealed, gossip was exchanged, and subtle power plays unfolded over goblets of wine and roasted lamb. The venue varied based on social class. A noble wedding might be held in a marble-clad atrium, with fountains murmuring in the background and silk tapestries decorating the walls. A middle-class family might host it in a courtyard with clay lamps and long wooden tables. But whether rich or modest, the feast had one thing in common. It needed to impress. Guests were greeted with perfumes and rose water, then seated according to rank. This was no casual buffet. The seating chart was a map of political favour. To be seated close to the newlyweds or their family meant you were someone. To be stuck near the kitchens? Not so much. The food was opulent when budgets allowed. Multiple courses, often starting with fruits and nuts, followed by fish, fowl, lamb, and exotic dishes flavoured with cinnamon, cloves, and honey. Bread was abundant. Wine flowed freely, often dangerously so. A well-timed toast could win favour, while a drunken slur could doom an entire branch of the family tree. Entertainment ranged from musicians with lyres and flutes to dancers, acrobats, and in some cases, elaborate theatrical performances. Poets might recite verses in praise of the bride's beauty or the groom's manliness. Again, not for romance. This was all for show. Even the cake had symbolism. A sweetened bread or honey pastry might be served to symbolize fertility and abundance. Eating it together signified unity. Not eating it? That could be a red flag, or at least a source of whispered speculation. But beneath the laughter and clinking cups, everyone knew the truth. This was not just a celebration of love. It was a careful display of wealth, power, and social standing, cloaked in honey and song. A wedding feast was Byzantium on a plate, glittering, complex, and never just what it seemed. The feast was over. The music faded. The guests dispersed. Now came the hard part. For the Byzantine bride, the wedding didn't mark a fairy tale ending. It marked the start of an entirely new reality. Once she crossed the threshold into her husband's household, she stepped into a complex web of expectations, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. Gone was the girl under her father's roof. She was now a Kyria, the mistress of the house. In theory, this was a promotion. In practice, it was often a pressure cooker. If she married into a large, extended family, common among wealthier households, she was suddenly under the scrutiny of her in-laws. The groom's mother typically held senior authority in the domestic space, and her approval wasn't guaranteed. The bride was expected to be modest, obedient, industrious, and pious. If she was beautiful, that was a bonus, but not a substitute for good behaviour. Her main job? Bearing children, preferably sons. Byzantine society placed enormous value on motherhood. A woman who produced multiple healthy sons was celebrated, respected, and gradually granted more authority. A woman who did not? Whispers, judgment, and sometimes, if her dowry wasn't large enough, rejection. And yet, the domestic sphere wasn't just a prison. It was also a stage. A clever bride could rise in influence by managing the household finances, overseeing servants, and navigating relationships with other women in the neighbourhood. Women often built informal networks of power, especially in urban settings like Constantinople, through the church, family ties, and trade connections. Religious life also shaped her daily routine. The Orthodox Church held strong sway over marriage roles, and the ideal wife was seen as a reflection of the Virgin Mary, pure, faithful, and quietly strong. Church attendance, fasting, and participation in saints' festivals were as expected as cooking dinner. If she came from a noble background, her husband might be posted to a provincial city, meaning she could suddenly find herself managing estates, raising children, and maintaining social decorum hundreds of miles from Constantinople. The glittering veil she wore at the wedding, that was for show. What followed was a life of duty, diligence, and often delicate survival. A Byzantine bride wasn't just a wife, she was a diplomat in her own home. In Byzantium, love was optional, politics were not. Behind the veils and liturgies, every marriage had the potential to reshape the empire. From rural villages to the imperial palace, a wedding was never just about two people. It was about what those two people represented. Families, factions, fortunes, and occasionally entire provinces. Among the aristocracy and ruling class, marriages were treated like treaties. The emperor might marry off his daughter to a foreign prince to secure peace with a neighbouring power. A military general could marry into the imperial family to gain legitimacy. Even church officials, though celibate themselves, often played matchmakers for political purposes. The Emperor Constantine VII, for example, famously used marriage alliances to consolidate his dynastic power. His own marriage to Helena, the daughter of Romanos Lekapenos, helped legitimize Romanos's rule and bind the two families together, even though Romanos was technically a usurper. These weren't romantic unions. They were strategic mergers, like silk-cloaked chess moves across the empire's grand board. Among merchants and bureaucrats, marriages also served to strengthen economic ties. A silk merchant might marry his daughter to the son of a shipping magnate, binding two trade networks together. A tax official might use his daughter's marriage to curry favour with a provincial governor. The dowry wasn't just wealth, it was leverage. And for the women involved, they were often the bridge, the bargaining chip, or the diplomatic glue. A noblewoman married into a rival family might be tasked with easing decades of tension through sheer charm, loyalty, and the production of grandchildren. Failure could mean disgrace. Success meant power. This extended beyond Byzantium's borders. Imperial brides were sometimes sent abroad to marry foreign rulers. Anna Porphyrogenita, niece of Emperor Basil II, was married off to Vladimir the Great of Kievan Rus, a union that helped convert an entire nation to Christianity. But it also meant she left Constantinople forever, a Byzantine princess turned foreign queen. These political unions could be brilliant or disastrous. A poorly chosen match could spark rebellion, insult allies, or destabilize entire regions. In Byzantium, the wedding crown wasn't just a symbol of love or martyrdom. It was a diplomatic tool, worn with grace, wielded with purpose. Not every Byzantine wedding ended in candlelit harmony and harmonious alliances. Some exploded, spectacularly. For all their pomp and planning, marriages in Byzantium could collapse under the weight of politics, personality clashes, or sheer bad luck. And when they did, the fallout wasn't just personal. It could be catastrophic for entire families, or even the empire itself. Take, for example, Emperor Justinian II. He married a noblewoman named Eudokia, and then, in a move both cold and calculated, divorced her to marry a Khazar princess named Theodora. The reason? Strategic alliance. The result? Outrage. His first wife's powerful family didn't forget the insult. Neither did the church. His reign became a case study in how not to juggle love and politics. Even when the marriage remained intact, scandal was never far. Adultery was one of the few reasons a woman could initiate divorce, but proving it, a nightmare. The legal system was stacked against women, and accusations of infidelity often ended in humiliation, exile, or worse. Noble women in particular were expected to maintain appearances at all costs, even in the face of neglect or abuse. There were also high-profile cases of fraudulent marriages where one party tricked or coerced the other into union, sometimes to gain inheritance rights or titles. These cases could end up in ecclesiastical courts, dragged out for years in theological and legal wrangling. The church had immense power in these matters, and bishops were not always impartial. And let's not forget the everyday tragedies. Young brides dying in childbirth, forced marriages between strangers decades apart in age, or political marriages that left both parties trapped and miserable. These stories didn't make it into official histories as often, but they were just as real. Sometimes even the ritual itself went off script. Ill omens, a candle going out, a crown dropping to the floor, a wine cup spilling, could be seen as divine warnings. Superstition swirled around the wedding like incense. In a society so attuned to signs and symbols, a bad omen at a wedding could cast a shadow over the entire union. For all their beauty and ceremony, Byzantine weddings weren't immune to failure. In fact, when they collapsed, they often collapsed imperially. Though the Byzantine Empire has long since crumbled into history, its wedding traditions left behind echoes, golden, incense-scented, and deeply influential. The elaborate rituals, the theological weight of marriage, the blend of Roman formality and Christian spirituality, all of it shaped not just Eastern Orthodox practices, but wedding customs across Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Even today you can walk into a Greek or Russian Orthodox wedding and see remnants of Byzantium. The crowning, the ceremonial walk, the chants. It's not just liturgy, it's time travel. Byzantine marriage was, above all, a public commitment. It wasn't just a couple exchanging vows, it was the merging of families, fortunes, and faiths. The state, the church, and the community were all watching. And that legacy continues in modern Eastern traditions, where weddings remain communal spectacles, blending old-world symbolism with contemporary flair. But there's a subtler legacy too. In a world that often relegated women to the margins, Byzantine marriage gave many women, especially noble women, real, if indirect, power. Through marriage, they gained influence, negotiated alliances, and protected dynasties. It wasn't always fair or romantic, but it was significant. Empresses like Theodora, Irene, and Zoe all began as brides, and some ended as rulers. Their rise was paved through marriage, but their impact reshaped religion, law, and imperial power. For these women, the wedding wasn't the climax of their lives, it was the prologue. Today, as we scroll through curated wedding photos and trend videos, it's easy to forget how ancient and complex this ritual really is. Beneath the white dresses and floral arches, the Byzantine wedding reminds us, marriage is more than a moment. It's structure, strategy, sacrifice, and sometimes, just sometimes, something like love. So the next time you see a couple walk down the aisle, imagine for a moment a candlelit church in Constantinople, golden crowns resting on two young heads, a crowd humming with expectation, and centuries of tradition binding them in silence. The Byzantine Empire may have fallen, but its weddings still echo, in veils, in vows, and in the strange, sacred theatre of matrimony. The Persian garden didn't merely imitate paradise, it defined it. In fact, the very word paradise comes from the Old Persian paradesa, meaning walled enclosure. These were not random patches of green, they were sacred spaces, meticulously designed, deeply symbolic, and breathtakingly beautiful. A Persian garden wasn't just where you planted flowers, it was where the divine touched the earth. In a region dominated by arid landscapes and blistering heat, the existence of a lush, shaded oasis with flowing water was nothing short of a miracle. That contrast was exactly the point. A Persian garden was meant to feel miraculous. It was a deliberate, artificial Eden, order imposed on chaos, nature tamed and honoured at once. And the design reflected that philosophy. Symmetry was everything. The classic Persian layout, called Chaharbagh, or four gardens, divided the space into four quadrants with intersecting water channels. This wasn't just practical irrigation, it was cosmology. The four-part layout symbolized the Zoroastrian and later Islamic concept of paradise, where four rivers of water, milk, wine, and honey flow from a sacred center. In the middle of many gardens sat a pavilion, pool, or platform, the symbolic heart. It was a place to rest, reflect, or recite poetry while surrounded by the elements, earth, air, water, and the soft scent of jasmine or roses. But Persian gardens weren't just sensory experiences. They were statements. Kings, nobles, and scholars used them to project power, intellect, and spirituality. The construction of a garden was an act of creation, not unlike building a palace or writing a great verse. In some cases, it was considered more noble. These were not spaces of wild, unchecked growth. Everything was chosen. The trees for shade and fruit, the flowers for colour and fragrance, the water for movement and sound. Birds, breezes, and reflections were part of the choreography. To enter a Persian garden was to step into a vision of perfect balance. Man, nature, and the divine in harmony. It was less about escape and more about elevation. It wasn't just where people walked, it was where heaven descended, by design. In Persia, water was more than a necessity. It was a miracle. And in the garden, it became the soul. Surrounded by deserts and rugged terrain, Persian engineers didn't rely on rain to feed their gardens. Instead, they mastered the qanat, an underground aqueduct system that tapped into distant mountain springs and channeled water for miles. It was invisible, ingenious, and essential. Without the qanat, the garden would be dust. With it, paradise bloomed. But once the water reached the garden, it wasn't just dumped into a pond, it was choreographed. Persian gardens used flowing water not just for irrigation, but as an experience. Thin channels, sometimes just a few inches wide, carved across the stone walkways, dividing the garden into symmetrical quadrants. These mirrored the four rivers of paradise mentioned in the Quran and earlier Zoroastrian texts. And the sound? That gentle trickling flow wasn't background noise. It was music, a soft, cooling counterpoint to the heat of the day and the stillness of the architecture. For visitors seated under pomegranate trees or beside rose beds, the presence of water engaged not just the eyes, but the ears and spirit. Fountains, too, became a focal point. Not the jet-powered marvels of European palaces, but subtle bubbling pools and geometric basins. The surface of the water reflected sky and structure, creating the illusion of infinity. This was a sacred mirror, the heavens touching the earth. Even more impressive was how water carried meaning. In many gardens, the main water channel led straight to a central pavilion, emphasizing unity, direction, and divine alignment. Flowing water meant movement, life, and time, but within the walls of the garden, it moved according to human design. It was, in a way, submission of nature to divine geometry. And yet, despite all the symbolism, water in a Persian garden remained refreshingly practical. It watered trees, cooled the air, and quenched thirst. The miracle lay in how seamlessly the practical and the poetic merged. In a land where water was life, the Persian garden turned it into poetry. Flowing, glistening, and eternal. A Persian garden was not wild. It didn't meander or sprawl. It obeyed, not just to human design, but to cosmic principles. Geometry was not decorative in these spaces. It was sacred. At the heart of Persian garden design lies the concept of order. Not the kind imposed with scissors and hedges, but a metaphysical order, where everything has its rightful place, purpose, and proportion. The most iconic layout, the Chaharbagh, or four-part garden, wasn't just efficient, it was spiritual. The Chaharbagh divided space into 4 equal sections, typically by water channels or walkways. At their intersection sat the spiritual heart of the garden, a pavilion, a platform, a fountain. This wasn't just clever landscaping. The 4-part design reflected ancient Persian cosmology. 4 elements, 4 cardinal directions, 4 seasons. It was heaven mapped onto earth. Even the walkways, walls, and planting rows adhered to strict grids and axial lines. Everything led somewhere, often toward a central axis or reflection pool. Visitors would be gently guided, never lost, never wandering. In a sense, the layout of the garden mirrored the moral and philosophical ideals of Persian society. Balance, clarity, and harmony between the material and the spiritual. Buildings integrated into the garden followed the same logic. Pavilions were often symmetrical and centrally placed, with open archways to allow airflow, light, and seamless transitions between indoors and out. The garden wasn't something you looked at. It was something you moved through, with deliberate progression and constant symmetry. This obsession with geometry wasn't about cold precision. It was a kind of worship. By imposing symmetry on space, Persian designers were imitating the perfection of divine creation. The garden became a reflection of paradise, not just in feel, but in form. Islamic art would later adopt and expand this love of geometry, and the Persian garden would become one of its earliest and most influential canvases. Long before domes and mosaics echoed the infinite, Persian gardeners were already drawing heaven into square plots and tiled paths. In a world of dust and disorder, the Persian garden offered shape, structure, and peace. It was sacred geometry, planted. Step into a Persian garden, and before your eyes adjust to the dappled light, your nose is already enchanted. The scent of roses, orange blossoms, basil, and jasmine. Not merely a luxury, but an essential element of the experience. Persian gardens weren't just visual. They were deeply sensory, and no sense was more pampered than smell. In a culture where poetry and philosophy were often intertwined with nature, flowers weren't random decoration. They were symbols. The rose, for instance, wasn't just beautiful. It represented divine love. The nightingale and the rose became recurring figures in Persian poetry, embodying passion, longing, and the fleeting nature of life. Pomegranates and figs added meaning beyond fruit. They symbolized fertility, abundance, and resurrection. Cypress trees were chosen not only for their height and shade, but for their association with eternity and the uprightness of faith. Nothing was accidental. Not colour, not fragrance, not even bloom cycles. Floral arrangements were chosen to ensure a succession of scents throughout the year. In spring, narcissus and tulips. In summer, damask roses and basil. In autumn, the last of the pomegranates. Even in winter, evergreen trees and structured paths kept the space from losing its poetry. Fragrance, in particular, was considered divine. In Islamic tradition, scent is associated with purity and paradise. The Prophet Muhammad was said to love perfume and fresh flowers. Thus, Persian gardens didn't just smell good, they brought the visitor closer to God. And the arrangement of these plants? Just as geometric as the layout. Rows of trees along the water channels, flower beds framed like living tiles, and shaded alcoves where scent pooled under archways. Even the act of walking through the garden was designed to bring you through layers of scent and texture. Shade turned to sunlight. The air, thick with the perfume of orange blossoms, might suddenly open into the earthy sweetness of fresh soil near the water's edge. It was immersive, not decorative. In a culture where poetry, prayer, and perfume often mingled, the garden became a sanctuary of all three. A space where every leaf spoke and every breeze carried a verse. This was paradise, and it bloomed with purpose. Persian gardens didn't stay confined within the borders of Persia. Their influence rippled across continents and centuries, shaping the landscapes of empires far and wide. When Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula into Persia, the garden tradition didn't vanish. It blossomed further. The Persian chaharbag concept became the blueprint for Islamic gardens across the Middle East and North Africa. The idea of a walled paradise with water channels, shaded paths, and pavilions was adapted and refined. The Mughal Empire in India, which had strong Persian cultural roots, took these ideas and created some of the most breathtaking gardens in history. The Taj Mahal's gardens are a perfect example, a formal, symmetrical layout featuring water pools reflecting the white marble mausoleum, vibrant flowers, and towering cypress trees. The Persian garden's ideals of paradise and perfection were reinterpreted through Indian sensibilities, but the core principles remained the same. In Europe, Persian gardens inspired Renaissance and Baroque garden designs. Italian and French landscapers were fascinated by the exotic allure and mathematical precision of Persian designs. The famous gardens of Versailles, with their intricate parterres and reflective pools, owe a debt to the Persian ideal of blending geometry with nature. But it wasn't just aesthetics that travelled. The symbolism, water as life, the fourfold garden representing the universe, plants symbolising virtues, these spiritual meanings influenced garden culture globally. Persian gardens became a kind of universal language for paradise on earth, adaptable to local climates and cultures, but always holding on to their core vision. A harmonious blend of art, nature, and spirituality. The walled garden, once a Persian invention, became a metaphor for a sacred refuge, a place where time slowed and worries faded. And today, whether in the courtyards of Morocco, the landscaped parks of India, or modern botanical gardens, you can trace the roots of this paradise back to those ancient Persian designs. The garden was never just a garden. It was a living, breathing legacy, carved from earth and water, designed to touch the soul. Water was the lifeblood of Persian gardens, but delivering it across arid landscapes was no small feat. Persian engineers mastered ingenious systems that brought cool, flowing water into these paradises, marrying utility with elegance. The Qanat system was a marvel of ancient engineering, a network of underground tunnels that gently channeled water from mountain aquifers to faraway oases and gardens. These subterranean aqueducts protected water from evaporation, allowing a steady, reliable supply even in the hottest, driest seasons. Without Qanats, Persian gardens might have been impossible dreams. Once water reached the garden, it was transformed from mere necessity into an art form. Narrow channels called rills divided the garden into symmetrical sections, not only irrigating plants but creating soothing sounds and visual lines. These flowing waterways acted like veins, bringing life and movement to the geometric layout. Fountains and pools added another layer of beauty and symbolism. Pools reflected the sky and surrounding architecture, creating illusions of infinity and blending earth with heaven. Fountains, with their gentle sprays, brought refreshing coolness and soft, calming music to the garden. The bubbling of water was a constant companion, intended to relax visitors and symbolize eternal life. This delicate balance of engineering and aesthetics reflected Persian philosophies, where nature was not conquered but harmonized with. Water was a symbol of purity, renewal, and divine blessing, especially in Islamic tradition. Gardens then became microcosms of paradise on earth, where water flowed eternally, sustaining all life within. The mastery of water management also demonstrated the technical genius of Persian civilization. The canals, pumps, and channels weren't just functional. They were designed with artistic intent, guiding the eye and footfall, creating spaces for reflection and contemplation. Persian gardens thus stand as testaments to a culture that valued the marriage of technology and spirituality. They remind us that beauty isn't just about what you see, but how nature, art, and human ingenuity flow together. In the end, the water in a Persian garden was more than irrigation. It was poetry in motion, life given form, and paradise made real. The Persian garden wasn't just about plants and water, it was also about architecture. Stone pavilions, delicate arches, and intricate tile work blended seamlessly with nature to create spaces that invited contemplation, poetry, and social gathering. Central to many Persian gardens was the pavilion or kiosk, a small, often open-sided structure that served as a place to rest, entertain, or enjoy the changing seasons. Positioned strategically, these pavilions offered stunning views of the garden's symmetry and water features. Built with carved wood, glazed tiles, or stucco, they reflected the craftsmanship and aesthetic ideals of the time. Walls were more than boundaries. They framed the garden as a sacred, private sanctuary. Often decorated with colourful mosaics or inscriptions, these walls enhanced the sensory experience while symbolising protection from the harsh outside world. They helped create an intimate atmosphere, separating the ordered paradise within from the chaotic desert or city outside. Pathways, usually paved with stone or brick, were designed to guide visitors through the garden in deliberate sequences. Walking through a Persian garden was meant to be a journey, moving from bright flower beds to shaded alcoves, from the sound of running water to quiet reflective pools. The architecture worked hand in hand with the landscape to choreograph this movement. Even the choice of building materials was symbolic. Tiles might feature floral patterns echoing the plants outside. Windows and screens allowed filtered light and gentle breezes, enhancing the sensory harmony. The blend of architecture and nature created not just beauty, but meaning. It was a stage for poetry recitals, philosophical debates, or quiet meditation. Rulers and poets alike found inspiration here. The garden was an extension of courtly life and intellectual pursuit. Moreover, this architectural approach deeply influenced Islamic, Mughal, and later European garden design. The idea that buildings and gardens should coexist and complement each other became a guiding principle. In Persian gardens, stone and flower, shadow and water were partners, crafting a paradise that was as much about human creativity as about the natural world. A Persian garden was alive, not just with water and fragrance, but with the passage of time itself. Its design took into account the changing seasons, creating an evolving landscape that reflected the cycles of nature and life. Spring in a Persian garden was a celebration of rebirth. Bulbs burst open with tulips, narcissus and crocus, filling the air with fresh scents. Fruit trees, pomegranate, apricot and peach, bloomed in soft pinks and whites, promising abundance. Paths were lined with lush green grasses and early herbs, welcoming visitors back from winter stillness. Summer brought shade and relief, Tall cypress and plane trees provided cool canopies over flowing water channels. Roses and jasmine unfurled their richest perfumes as the sun climbed high. Pools shimmered like mirrors, reflecting blue skies and fluttering birds. The garden was a refuge from the heat, a place for contemplation, poetry, and slow afternoon tea. Autumn's arrival shifted the mood. Leaves turned golden and red. Pomegranates and figs ripened for harvest. The garden became a tapestry of warm colours, fragrant with ripe fruit and earth. Gardeners prepared the soil and trimmed plants, knowing the cycle would soon turn again. Even winter had its role. Evergreens stood proud against pale skies, their needles providing texture and life when flowers slept. The structural beauty of stone pathways, walls and pavilions took centre stage. Snow, when it fell, added a quiet purity, blanketing the garden in white silence. This awareness of time was spiritual. In Persian and Islamic thought, life itself was cyclical, a journey through creation, decay, and renewal. The garden was a microcosm of that journey. Visitors were reminded that beauty and life were transient, to be savoured but not clung to. The changing garden was also a practical necessity. Different plants thrived in different seasons, and the garden's design ensured that there was always something blooming or bearing fruit, sustaining the senses year-round. By embracing time, Persian gardens became living poems, unfolding slowly, deeply, beautifully. They were not static snapshots of paradise, but ever-changing reflections of heaven on earth. The Persian garden is more than a historical curiosity. Its legacy stretches far beyond the deserts of Iran, continuing to inspire and enchant across cultures and centuries. From the courts of the Mughal emperors in India to the grand estates of Europe, the Persian ideal of a walled paradise with flowing water and harmonious design has left an indelible mark. The Taj Mahal's gardens, the Alhambra's courtyards, and the Versailles fountains all owe something to those ancient Persian blueprints. But the Persian garden's influence isn't just aesthetic, it's philosophical. At its core, the garden embodies a vision of harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine. It invites contemplation, peace, and the reminder that paradise is not just a distant afterlife, but something to be created here on earth. Modern Iranian gardens, such as the historic Fin Garden in Kashan, continue to preserve this heritage, blending ancient techniques with contemporary artistry. Meanwhile, landscape architects worldwide look to Persian principles when designing sustainable and spiritually resonant spaces. The garden's design principles, symmetry, water management, sensory richness, also resonate with today's ecological challenges. Persian gardens teach us the value of balance, patience, and respect for natural resources, even in the face of harsh environments. Ultimately, the Persian garden is a timeless symbol. It is an earthly paradise carved from sand and stone, a sanctuary where water sings and flowers tell stories. It reminds us that beauty and order can emerge from scarcity, and that human creativity, when guided by reverence for nature, can transform the world.